All right, so first of all, I want to just talk a little bit about my role here. I'm sort of the grand old man that talks about the good old days. More to the point, I am not playing Linus Torvalds and trying to be in charge of everything for the entire lifetime of me. I did that for 10 years in the 80s and into the early 90s, and then that 10 years was enough. And I'm very happy to see that we have had continued turnover of leadership and new people coming in place, and you're not stuck with my view of exactly how things should be done. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. I'm going to talk about some history, in this case of the BSD Daemon. Now this was actually an interesting project that I got roped into doing for the Developers Summit. And I kind of did it at the last minute. And so when I got there, I had sort of a collection of slides that I hadn't really looked at, no concept really of what I was going to say, and a big pile of T-shirts. And so if you watch the video of it, you know, there's George is there and he's holding up shirts, and I go on rambles. So it was an hour and a half, and when I finally got rid of all the crap in it, it turned into a 40-minute video. But hopefully this one will be a little more focused, because I now have 41 slides, and I don't have lots of shirts, and so hopefully it'll be a little more coherent this time. One of the things that was very interesting about putting this talk together was that I had to go through boxes and boxes and boxes of shirts. I've been described as the Imelda Marcos of T-shirts. I have, well, at one time, about 1,000 of them. And so I can be wearing a shirt that, you know, I'm wearing it for maybe the second time ever, even though it's like a 30-year-old shirt. But the other thing is that pictures used to be done with these things called film, and they got printed on little pieces of paper. And so my digital photography only goes back to around the beginning of the 00s, and everything before that is in boxes and boxes and boxes of pictures. And so I ended up going through many of these boxes of pictures looking for things that were some of the earlier bits of the history. And one of the pictures that I came across, I just couldn't resist putting in here, which is the next slide. But before I show you that slide, what I want to tell you is where this picture came from. I was at Berkeley, and at the time we were just getting ready to release, or had just released BSD, which later became known as 1BSD. The main thing that was in that was the Pascal system, compiler and interpreter and debugging and all that. And so I decided, well, you know, people are using this, and so I could put together a tutorial about it. And so I submitted a thing to do a tutorial, and they accepted it. And then they said, oh, well, you need to get a picture sent in. Well, I didn't really have a picture, and so I sent some random little picture, and they go, no, no, you need to go to like a professional photographer and get your picture taken. And so I did that, and I sent them this picture. They got one look at this picture, and they said, you're too young. Nobody's going to sign up for your tutorial. And they were right. 5 people signed up, and 4 of them actually showed up for that tutorial. But the good news is that I've, since that time, improved the number of people that come to attend. And I figured out, somewhere in the order of 10,000 students at this point. The other benefit is that this guy named Eric Allman saw this picture. And well, we had sort of a 3-year on and off thing, but eventually decided to move in together. And last month celebrated our 46th anniversary, so that kind of worked out. Okay, so let's start with the name of the daemon. The daemon is unnamed. He is the BSD Daemon. But people can't cope with the idea that he doesn't have a name. So they kept coming up with names. And one of the names they came up with was the name of the person that used to harass me in high school. And it's like, all right, Chuck is not going to be his name. That's just not happening. So we finally, BSD seemed to sort of settle in as the right name to use. And of course, there was the whole thing of, you know, this is a demon, and it's like, it's not a demon, D-E-M-O-N. That's an evil spirit. Rather, it's a daemon, which is a deified being, half man, half God. And so, anytime people start talking about the devil or the demon, you need to explain this to them. All right. So let's start sort of really at the beginning. And sort of the first place where we get a notion of the demon is this picture here. It was commissioned by someone named Mike O'Brien, who was big in the early UNIX days. And he had this person, Phil Figlio, was his roommate. And the apartment they rented had a safe. And they kept their valuables in that safe. At some point, Mike O'Brien moved out. And then, maybe a year or so later, Phil was moving out. And he realized his valuables were in the safe, but he didn't know what the combination to the safe was. And furthermore, Mike had no idea what it was either. Mike had gotten actually a credential to be a locksmith, and so he had access to books that explained how to crack safes, and it was a fairly crappy safe. So in about 15 minutes, he managed to get the safe open, and the compensation that he got was Phil, who was an artist, drew this picture. And this is, of course, a PDP-11, and there's the pipes, and there's dev null over here. And then there's the little demons that are running around, and they're the processes that run in the background to do stuff on your behalf. And you'll notice here, first of all, that it's signed by Figlio, which I have this thing about where artists' names get removed from things when they get put on various posters and so on. All right, so that's the very first picture that we have. The first sort of use of that beyond just the poster, well, actually, Mike O'Brien had some shirts made up with that image on it. But the sort of most widely publicized was when UNIX, for the 10th anniversary, had this on the T-shirt. And you'll notice here that somehow the artist's name has disappeared off the picture, or off the shirt. So the time rolls on, and now we're getting ready to print the manuals for BSD, and we wanted some kind of cover art. And so Sam Leffler, who was one of the early people working on BSD, eventually had left and had gone to Lucasfilm. Lucas at this point was doing the Star Wars movies. He'd done the very first one. It had been wildly successful. All the special effects were done with blue screen and models and so on. And he wanted to try and bring some computer technology into making that an easier thing to do. And so Sam was in the Lucasfilm computer division. He was there, and the early stuff they were doing was really just scanning films and being able to add a few artifacts and so on. It was nowhere near where we are today. But one of the other things that happened there was that John Lasseter, who was an artist, a lead animator at Walt Disney, was on a sabbatical. So in the old days of cartoons at Disney, there was the sort of 3 levels of hierarchy. Everything was all hand-drawn. And so the lead animator would draw a cell, and then they'd do the next cell that was 1 second later in the movie. And then what would happen is that the second level artists were called the in-betweeners, and they would fill in the 29 frames between those two. And then finally, the lowest level people were the colorizers, and so they'd be filling in all little bits of color. And they were given a little bit of artistic stuff, the tail. They could get to draw the tail and make it go woo, or something exciting like that. At any rate, the lead animators, because they were so important at Disney, were treated sort of like university professors. And so every 5 years, they would get a 6-month sabbatical where they could go off and recharge their batteries. So John Lasseter took his sabbatical at Lucasfilm. And of course, the thing that he was interested in was this notion of using computers to help with the animation process. And so one of the things that they were trying to do at Lucasfilm was to build an animator's workstation. Well, they had people that knew massive amounts about graphics and computer graphics and all that, but they didn't have the clue as to how someone that was actually an animator, what kind of user interface they wanted. And so to them, having an actual animator come and spend 6 months there and go, that's ridiculous, you don't do it like that, you know, I need this and I need to be able to do that and I want this to move and so on and so forth. And so it was great, you know, they came up with something which is actually the basis for what's used today. RenderMan also came out of that project, believe it or not. So the upshot was that Sam was there. He had just left Berkeley. He knew we needed cover for the manual. And so he said to John, oh, John, could you just draw us up a picture? And he showed him the previous thing, you know, the little demon guys here. And so I don't have the picture with me like I did down in the previous talk, but this is literally a piece of sort of cream-colored cardboard that he pulled out of the wastebasket. And there was a tray that had chalk on it, and he just, in about, Sam said, 20 minutes maybe, drew this up. And you notice that it has a sort of Disney-esque, sort of the big eyes and the other things you would kind of associate with Disney. I don't say that too loudly because then Disney might have a fit, but that's kind of where this came from. And then, there's the glowing orb, which says UNIX on it. And you can see that it's throwing a shadow, and down underneath the tail, which is a little hard to see in this picture, but he signed it right underneath the tail there. Okay, so this, of course, then got used on the manuals. Voila. So these were published by UNIX. And remember, in those days, UNIX was licensed and you had to buy a license. If you were a university, you got it for not much money, and it was a perpetual license, and then you could have it on as many machines as you wanted, blah, blah, blah. Because in those days, AT&T was not allowed to sell computer stuff. There was the dissent decree where IBM sold computers and had nothing to do with telephones, and the opposite for AT&T. So they could do stuff internally, but they could not sell anything having to do with computers. So, great. Let it go out into the world. I mean, they keep a license on it. We know who's doing stuff, but that was about the extent of it. But that meant that you couldn't just go to a publisher and have them publish this stuff which was unlicensed material. But UNIX had a license, and so they could print the manuals and make sure that they only sent the manuals out to people that had licenses. Okay, so we roll on here. This daemon got used in a whole bunch of ways. And so the first one was that it got colorized. Now, I want you to just notice here, he has no shoes on. Okay. He's naked. I mean, let's just be honest here. Okay, but for some reason, when they went to do this, they felt he needed shoes. He didn't need any other clothes, but he had to have shoes. Okay, so this is the first place where you start seeing him wearing sneakers. And of course, the BSD, UNIX, etc. Okay, so I got a request from St. Olaf College in Minnesota saying, oh, we'd like to use him in our logo for our computer science department. And I early on came up with this thing of, well, I want to keep control of the copyright, of the licensing, but I want people to be able to do reasonable stuff with it. So the royalty that I collect is that you have to send me 2 T-shirts, one in medium, one in large, because I fit medium and Eric fits large. And so that's how I have this ever-growing collection of T-shirts, which mostly involve things having a daemon on it. And there's certain rules, like you can't have the daemon fucking tux your, those kinds of nasty bits. Okay. It even got picked up by the Bay Lisa. The Lisa is the large installed system administrators. And in this particular case, you can see he's working with this thing called Ethernet. In the old days, that was actually like a wire, and you know. And then another one of my favorite ones, the Love, Peace, and Rdist. Rdist was sort of a predecessor of rsync. And so, I'm not quite sure. These were the people that were, trying to promote Rdist as a thing. I mean, it was open source software. They weren't getting any money for it. But nevertheless, they wanted to have T-shirts, so I got 2 of those. All right, so now it's time to move on to the second version of the John Lasseter daemon. And this came about because we needed we wanted to have it for our textbook. This was the very first textbook that we did about BSD, design and implementation of the 3 BSD operating system. And in this particular case, of course, I wanted John Lasseter to do it. Sam was still at Lucasfilm and still had some contact with John, who wasn't there at that point, but got in touch with John. And, oh, I know, it was John had come up to visit. That's right. He'd come up to visit because he wanted to see the next iteration of the animator's workstation and give more feedback. And at that point, I think he was trying to get Disney to actually buy a couple of them. Because this is the one where this was just a blue piece of cardboard that he pulled out and some more crayons or chalk. No, this is actually chalk also. And again, you can see underneath his tail there, it says John Lasseter 88. And this one, I wanted to, make it clear that, it was a work for hire. So it was a work for hire, and I paid him $1,000 for it. And, you got the paperwork because Addison Wesley wasn't going to let me, put something on the cover of a book that I didn't have the rights to do that with. And in fact, I had said, well, we've got this BSD Daemon we want to put on the cover, and I don't think they really, connected what that was, because when I actually sent it to them, or print a picture of it, they're like, oh, we can't possibly put this on a book. This is a serious textbook. And we were first-time authors, and usually first-time authors get no say about anything. But someone whispered in my ear that, if you really insist on it, they will eventually cave. And so we're like, no, really, we want it on there. And see, it was on the cover of the manuals, and everyone associates it with this. It'll help with sales, and blah, blah, blah. And so they eventually did relent and put it on the book. Now, you'll first of all notice that the glowing orb is missing, because the glowing orb was going to be there, but they didn't want to put UNIX in it, because even though it said 4.3 BSD UNIX operating system, they didn't want to put it on the orb. So, but the shadow is still coming down. But none of them knew who John Lasseter was. So of course, John Lasseter does not appear underneath his tail in this particular instance. Okay, so that book then went on to sell 50,000 copies, and suddenly we looked brilliant. Okay, so time continues rolling forward. Oh yeah, there's many other instances. Somebody actually did a stitching pattern for the daemon. This is 20,000 stitches, and you may have seen, actually Margot was wearing a variant of this earlier today.
The shoes are blue now.
What?
The shoes are blue now.
Yes, yeah. The problem was that if you only get like 4 thread colors. And so if we'd want to do red, then when you did the red down into the sneakers, they didn't stand out enough. And so they went back and changed used one of the blue colors for the shoes. Yeah, some compromises in certain technologies here. Okay. I did also, at that point, I guess it was the early 90s, I did a trip around Australia. They have a meeting in September, which is a single countrywide meeting. This was their equivalent of UNIX. And then in the February, March, April timeframe, each state has their own conference. And there's 7 states plus the capital territory. And so what they did is they had them on a 1-week headway. So I spent 2 months traveling to every capital city in Australia and giving a lecture and so on. So they made this commemorative shirt of McKusick doing Oz. And I got more than 2 copies of this one. All right, and then of course there's the, we continue to have the, let's have some fun. So DOS was the big thing to poke fun at, so we're poking fun at it. And then of course when FreeBSD got released, they wanted to have a t-shirt. And so here I did a special version of it where the daemon is free. And note that John Lasseter's signature is on this picture. But of course, FreeBSD wouldn't really fit in there, so we just stuck that up at the top. It wouldn't fit in the orb. And of course, the very well-known version that was done for the Walnut Creek CD-ROM, where the daemon is walking out. I'm a collector, so I have every version of FreeBSD DVD that was released. So I went through, and 2.1 was the first one that had this picture on it. And it continued on there for several years, several releases. OK, so time rolls forward. And now it's time for us to do the next version of the book. And we had done the 4.4 book. Or we're doing the 4.4 book. And so I wanted a new version of the daemon. So at this point, Lucasfilm's computer division, well, the Star Wars movies, the first trilogy had come out, and there had been a long gap. And so this huge influx of money that had been coming into Lucasfilm started to dwindle. And so he had a whole slew of projects that he'd started, and he couldn't really continue to support all those projects. And so the computer division had done what he wanted them to do, and so they got spun out and into a thing called Sprocket Systems, which eventually became Pixar. And so, as I'd said, John Lasseter was really excited about Animator's Workstation and using computers more for doing cartoons. And when he'd gone back to Disney, they were just like, no, we're not doing that. That's just cheap. We believe in the true way that we've been doing it for 50 years and blah, blah, blah. And so John got rather discouraged by this and left Disney and came to Pixar, because Pixar was all about doing things with computer animation. And early on, they didn't really have the money to do a feature-length film, but they did a lot of advertising, 1-minute ads that would run on TV and things like that. And so what had happened is that they had, Steve Jobs bought Pixar, and Steve Jobs went to Disney and said, look, we want you to fund doing a feature-length film. And there wasn't really any other place they could talk to, and Steve Jobs wasn't rich enough at that point to do it himself. And so the upshot was that Disney got this incredible contract, which was, all right, we're going to pay for it, and you're going to get complete artistic control. But we are going to get 90% of the revenue that comes from showing it. And Pixar goes, well, all right, just at least let us get the spin-offs for, any merchandise. Because at that time, merchandise associated with films was nothing, zero. It just didn't happen. But, they were doing Toy Story. there's some really obvious merchandising that can go on here. And of course there was. I mean, they went to the people that they were using the toys of and said, we want to do a joint thing with you where we'll get some of the royalty from you selling these toys. And a bunch of the toy companies were like, nah, we're not doing that. But a select set of them did, and boy, did they ever look smart, because the merchandising brought in twice as much money as the receipts from showing the movie. And boy, was Disney surprised. All right, but I digress. So I went to John. They had just, they were getting going on Toy Story, and he was like the lead guy for Toy Story. And so he was, let's just say, a little bit busy. But one of the things I learned was that making friends with his secretary was a really good plan. And so I would go in, and I mean, he'd agreed to do it, but then there's the agreeing and then getting it done. And so I went, I'd go in and say hi, and I'd bring flowers or chocolates or some little thing. And he's like, well, he says he doesn't really know what you want. I said, well, I want him to be kind of animated, instead of just sort of standing there. Let's have him chase the glowing orb. And so she said, all right, I'll give him that. And so about a week later, I got a bunch of sketches from John. This is being the one that I sort of like the best. And I said, yeah, something like that. And so then time really started to go on and on and on. And the problem was we were getting to the point where the book was going to go into production, and we didn't have the picture yet. And they're like, look, if you don't have the picture by this date, we're doing something else for the cover, because we're just not going to wait that long. So I got a little more desperate, and I think I sort of upped it. Instead of just like some flowers, it was like a really nice box of See's chocolate. Anyway, the upshot was that I get a call from her and said, okay, he's done it. And I went in to pick it up, and she said, he'd said, all right, I put it on his schedule for this particular day, and I had the paper there, and I had all his pens, and they were all inked and lined up. And she said, he sat down, and he just, he had the picture, the little sketch next to him, and he kind of sat there for about 5 minutes, and it didn't move. And she says, is everything okay? Is something missing? And he goes, I haven't drawn an animation cell in 8 years. I don't know if I can still do it. And then she said, he picked up the black pen, picked up the other, something like 15 minutes this got done in. And of course, signed underneath, John Lasseter, 94. Okay, so armed with the picture, I sent it off to the publisher with days to spare. And of course, it became the cover of this book. Now, I want you to go back and notice here, he's chasing the orb. He's starting to go after it. And so, of course, the orb is trying to take off because it doesn't want to get stabbed. Well, they looked at this and they go, that looks much too much like a sperm cell. So you'll notice when we get on the book, somehow the glowing orb has just disappeared. He's just running for a good time, I guess. But you will notice that John Lasseter's name, who's now, by the time the book came out, associated with this movie called Toy Story, which everybody's talking about. So suddenly the marketing people think it's okay to leave the John Lasseter's name on there. If you look inside on the copyright page in all of the books, we always credit him with the cover. But this is the first time now it finally appears on the book cover itself. And he also appears on the spine, and miraculously the glowing orb is missing on that one as well. There was an interesting story here. Actually, it was the previous book. And we get this distressed call from Addison Wesley. And apparently the people that deal with books for schools in Oklahoma have decided that this book is going to be banned because it's got a devil on the cover. And they don't want those high school kids to be exposed to the devil. So they want us to write a letter and say, no, really, this is a technical book and blah, blah, blah. And Keith Bostick looks at me and he goes, don't do that. I mean, how many people in Oklahoma are going to buy that book? Just put a big banner across it that says, banned in Oklahoma. You'll sell a lot more copies. They didn't see the humor in it. Okay. So again, there was a stitch pattern. This was actually the one that Margot was wearing this morning. This one was it's actually a bigger stitch pattern, and it had 27,000 stitches in it. But it turned out that the MS-DOS machines that run the stitchers, for whatever reason, can't deal with more than about 24,000 stitches. So I had to go back to the artist and say, could you please remove 3,000 stitches? Who knew? Okay. Well, time went on, and so the AT&T started, well, Berkeley started working on trying to get a redistributable, un-AT&T licensed version of BSD out. And initially, well, what had happened was that the consent decree had ended. So now AT&T was allowed to sell computers and computer systems. And so now they're starting to sell UNIX. And so the price jumped from like $20,000 to $250,000. And it was for one machine, and you had to pay extra for any additional machines, and it was limited to 10 people that were allowed to have access to it, and you paid extra for more people, and blah, blah, blah. Well, there were a lot of people in those days. Well, let's go back. The IBM PC was very limited both in its compute and memory. And so if you wanted to have, let's say, TCP/IP on it, there really just wasn't room to put TCP/IP into the operating system. So the way you did it was on the board that just looked like a peripheral to the PC. And so they needed to have the TCP/IP in that. And so they came to us and said, look, can you just at least give us TCP/IP code? And so we talked to the Berkeley lawyers and back and forth. But eventually we did what we called the networking release 1. And that was the TCP code in the kernel and the socket level stuff and all of the great utilities like rlogin and a few other things that should never have gotten out but did. At any rate, RSH, yes. The upshot was that was very successful. And so we decided that we would try and get more. Well, Keith Bostic decided we would try and get more. And Mike and I, who were sort of dealing with the kernel for the most part, and Keith was, he was doing everything. I mean, he was dealing with all the user level stuff, all the comments that came in, so phone support and everything. But anyway, we're like, well, we don't really know how to do the kernel, but why don't you go ahead and see what you can do with that user land stuff? And so we would go to UNIX conferences, and we would have these BOFs, birds of a feather, and Keith would get up and say, here's a list of all the programs we need. Write a version from scratch and send it in and get your name in lights, And the easy stuff like cat came in, and eventually ls, and so on and so forth. But when things like groff came in, we're like, oops, this may actually happen. And so Keith came in and said, oh, how's that going, guys, on the kernel? And I look at Mike, and Mike looks at me, and it's like, we can't go to UNIX and ask people to rewrite the kernel. But Keith came up with this idea as, there's no problem that he can't solve given 10 minutes to think about it. So what we did is we took 32V, which was essentially version 7 that had been ported roughly to the VAX, and we ran it through a beautifier to put it in sort of a canonical form, and then built a database, a line, for each line as an entry. And then we took the BSD kernel and we ran it through the same beautifier, and then we went line by line by line through every file of the kernel and looked it up to see if it appeared in 32V. And of course, a brace on a line by itself, all that kind of stuff's going to pop out. But if you get like 3 or 4 lines of code that all matched, it's like, oh, we know where that came from. But there's easy things to deal with. So for example, the thing that looked up, you do get PID and it needs to look through and find that entry. Well, the original version 5 or 6 of UNIX, basically the process table was a static 16-entry table. So it was for I equals 0, I less than 16, step through the table. Well, it had gotten a little bigger, but it was still the same otherwise code. And we're like, that's a couple hundred in size these days. I bet if we did that with a hash lookup, it'd go a lot quicker. So we got rid of the linear search and did a hash lookup, and that code didn't look anything like AT&T. So, we just did an improvement. We improved away from the problem. So we did that, blah, 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 and pretty soon we had, all but 6 files that were, absolutely clean. And it's like, well, we could do those last 6 files, but if we release a whole kernel, that's going to look kind of bad. And so we'll just say, well, it's a partial kernel and utilities and so on. That came out as network release 2. And there's a long, interesting story there, but I'm not going to do that one. But the upshot was that BSDI got started, which was a company that was commercially supporting this free distribution. And they did a few things that kind of caught the attention of AT&T. Like their phone number was 1-800, it's UNIX. And their ads ran things like 99% cheaper than the UNIX from AT&T. And they didn't like that. So a lawsuit happened. And so this shirt came out, is the things starting to heat up with, may the source be with you, to promote the free software. Well, whoops. The lawsuit came into full tilt, and so I had a couple more images done to try and, create shirts to promote, stir up trouble. So this is one of the Daemon, and he's slam dunking the Death Star. So I don't know if you remember, the Death Star is kind of the AT&T logo, or it was at that time. And so here he's slam dunking it. And the caption on this was net to USL 0. And then the next shirt was this one. He's standing on top of the world. He skewered the Death Star, which is kind of deflated on his trident. And the Daemon is wearing my Birkenstocks. And this one, I was able to find one of the shirts. So here we are with Free the Berkeley 4.4. And this, again, was a very popular shirt. I probably sold about 1,000 of those shirts. And you can see C. Peel just behind the shoe there, who's the artist, because I believe that the artist name should remain on the art. Okay, so the BSD Daemon ended up being used by a lot of the later organizations that started up BSD. So there's Free BSD and NetBSD, and before too long, OpenBSD. So this was one of the early NetBSD logos. This was one of the early OpenBSD logos. Even the FreeBSD Foundation had the Daemon in a 3-piece suit. Now, of course, all of these organizations today use other logos because the Daemon in certain environments is still not viewed very favorably. And so he's been kind of relegated to history at this point, but we still keep fond memories. I also came up with some of the other images that were used. This was, he was marketing, and this was sort of the image, and what he's whacking, there were a huge number of things. I mean, there were some inappropriate things, like he was whacking a penguin, but there were other ones where he was, whacking MS-DOS, et cetera.
Is this the first appearance of the green shoes?
Yeah, so the green shoes somehow got done when it got off into the spin-off from Walnut Creek people. I don't, how that happened, I don't know. But you see green much more often now than you see the original red. But you notice that's the only clothing any of the daemons are ever wearing. Just saying. Okay, this is one that I really like, the power to serve. And the BSD with the documentation, the fact that the BSD actually has like good documentation, which back in those days, I mean, you talk about Linux not being up to speed with documentation. In those days, they didn't have it. The code was the documentation as far as they were concerned. Then there was a thing called the FreeBSD News, which was a online publication. So this is Daemon, reading through his Daemon News. And then, of course, when they were getting ready to do the new 4.0 release, there he is driving a truck to carry him around. So I thought just, for historic reasons, it's kind of amusing to see the copyright assignment. So this is the letter that got written essentially from me to John Lasseter saying, these 3 pictures that you've done for me and that they're works for hire and blah, blah, blah. And so, signed by me and more interestingly, signed by John Lasseter. So it's always kind of cool to have, I have a piece of paper signed by John Lasseter. But then the real point is you then turn this into the Copyright Office. And so, I now legally have a copyright. Now, owning the copyright and actually being able to enforce the copyright turned out to be 2 rather different things. And I have been remarkably unsuccessful in many cases. There's one company in the UK that has it on vending machines for condoms. And it just pisses me off. And someone in the UK got a lawyer to look into what it would take to get them to take it out. And it was going to cost about $10,000, and that was back when $10,000 is worth a lot more than it is today. And no guarantee that, that would necessarily finish the case. And so I'm just like, fine, whatever. But whenever I get notification, I send something, and mostly they just stop using it. Occasionally they don't, but at least they know that somebody has a copyright and they're not supposed to be doing it. Just the back of the copyright there. Okay, so I'm also now going to take the opportunity, since I have 10 more minutes, to talk about 2 other things. The first one is you may notice that every 7 years we do a new edition of the textbook. And you may also notice that it has been 10 years since the most recent textbook came out. And so actually a couple years ago, we went back to Pearson Education, who were the people that currently own it. It started with Addison Wesley, and they got sold and sold and sold. Anyway, Pearson Education has it. And Pearson Education, I mentioned also that first one sold 50,000 copies. The second one sold 25,000 copies. The third one sold about 10,000 copies. And the most recent one has sold maybe 6,000 or 7,000 copies. So people just don't buy textbooks. They just grab them online for free, because inevitably it gets put online, and that's that. So it's not very remunerative, shall we say, to write a textbook anymore. That being said, we still feel like it's an important thing to do. And so we went to Pearson and said, all right, we're gung-ho. We're ready to write the next edition. And they're like, oh, well, we're kind of getting out of the textbook thing. And, we're not really sure what we're going to do here. But go ahead and write it. We'll see how maybe in a couple of years we'll feel better about it. And it's like, right. So we said, OK, fine. Will you? They hold the copyright. I mean, we signed the copyright over to them because they do the publishing. We said, will you sign the copyright back to us? And they were like, oh, well, yeah, I guess we could do that. But saying they're going to do it and actually getting it done turns out to be 2 different things. So it went back and forth and back and forth. It was like a tennis game where like no one's ever going to finish the job. But we did finally, just a few months ago, get a signed thing from Pearson saying, here it is. We're returning the copyright to you. And you have the right to use it. The only requirement is that you have to, in the front, say, previously published by Pearson Education. That's it. Fine. And they'll stop selling the current edition whenever we say we're going to release the new one. Okay, well, then the next question is, so, okay, they're not going to publish it. Who is going to publish it? And the two obvious ones were O'Reilly and No Starch Press. And O'Reilly's stuff, I mean, they haven't been doing a lot of technical book publishing. I mean, they still publish books, but they do a lot of other things. Whereas No Starch Press, they still have their nose to the grindstone and they want to do books. So I talked to them first, and they were like, yes, we want that. Please do sign up to do that. Okay, so great. We got the copyright, we got the publisher. Now this is a mere matter of writing. Well, you may remember from the previous book that there are three authors. There is myself, George Neville Neal, and Robert Watson. Robert Watson wrote Chapter 5, Security. George wrote the 3 networking chapters. I wrote pretty much everything else. Okay, I am now in my 70s, and I don't have quite the mental capacity that I once had. And furthermore, I sort of have this goal, like I said earlier, I didn't want to be Linus Torvalds. Well, I don't also want to be the person that this book ends if I die. So I decided to say, I think it's time to move forward. And so we're expanding the set of authors. I'm going to be responsible for the preface, the history, and okay, the fast file system. And that's it, other than cat herding. Okay, George's going to still do the networking. Robert's still going to do security. But notice we have John Baldwin, who's doing 4 and 5, kernel services, process management, and we're adding a new chapter on virtualization. That was just a section in the previous book. We're expanding that to a whole chapter because that's obviously a big deal. And so John signed up to do those. I tagged Warner. He's going to do the 7 and 8, which is the I/O system and devices, which, compared to me, Warner is just like he knows it all. So, and system startup. That's always been like the orphan chapter because nobody that ever was writing the book, including myself, really knew much about it. And so it's a really lame chapter and always has been. Warner knows a lot about system startup, so I'm expecting that chapter to be pretty beefy. And I've tagged Mark Johnson to do memory management because that's a chapter that's always been a struggle for me, but I've managed to keep doing it because I basically have Alan Cox's ear to help. I did the original ZFS with a lot of help from the original ZFS developers, but Alan Jude, of course, is just way on top of that, so he's signed up to do that. And who else should do network file systems but, of course, Rick Macklem, who's been doing a lot of that. So there's going to be a lot of cat herding going on, but I feel confident about that. And there's a set of people that are going to be able to carry this book forward in the future. So that's another checkbox that I have here. Now you're probably wondering when it is you're going to be able to buy this book. Well, it turns out that we've always done it in GROF. And the original one was done in that because that was the best thing that was available at the time. We have a macro package that jumps through hoops. I mean, if you look at it, the pages are balanced, and there's the hyphenation is dealt with, and all of that is done by GROF. But what it means is that in the past, I've had to do all of that formatting and making sure it's all laid out exactly right. We just give a PDF to the publisher, and boom, they do it. Well, these days, the kids don't use GROF. And remember, I'm trying to get myself out of the loop. And the other thing is that No Starch Press, all of their stuff is set up with LaTeX. So we're in the midst of converting from GROF to LaTeX. In fact, we had a meeting last night about it. And this turns out to be, I thought that was going to be like, a month process. And we're already on about month 4 now. And I was going to say 2/3 of the way there, but it might be a little overly optimistic. But we're getting to the point where we can kind of start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, to start off, I just wrote an awk script, which took me 6 weeks to write, to just go over and sort of massively change things. And I thought, all right, the hard work is done. No, maybe 40% was done. Anyway, so we're doing that. A lot of these authors, I've just told them, don't start editing until we at least have something where we're in LaTeX so that you'll be editing the actual LaTeX. The other benefit, of course, is that once we get this done, then No Starch Press has all the people in-house, so they can do the copy editing, they can do the typesetting, and that's also off my plate. So it's painful, but going forward, all these people, they had to do LaTeX for their high school papers, and they've been using it ever since. So they understand how LaTeX works, which is good because I sure don't. But John's been teaching me. I'm slow but trainable. Okay, so that was that. I have one more little thing to show off today, and that is I got a custom puzzle made by Liberty Puzzles. They are in Boulder, Colorado, and they bake these puzzles which are laser cut. So this is a 478-piece puzzle. I've brought the upper right-hand corner. So the demon that's in the upper right-hand corner, it's 85 pieces here. So I'm going to just lay this out on the table if you want to come down and see what they look like, or in about 20 minutes you can put this piece of the puzzle together because it's just one little part. The other thing is, of course, I got it, and so I did a YouTube video of how to assemble the puzzle in 5 minutes. And it was basically, I just put a table down with a camera down, and Eric and I just spent about 6 or 7 hours doing the puzzle, and the camera was just continuously running. And then I just edited it down, so the only part, anytime one of us puts a piece in, that little bit got clipped out, and then while we contemplate for the next minute what to do next, that's all cut out. And then after you've done that, then you speed it up to 20x, and it only takes 5 minutes, and it's done. Okay, so at that point, or at this point, I am ready to take any questions for the next 5 minutes. Anyone got a question? Sure.
So I agreed that the variant looked like a sperm, but before it represented a sperm, what did the glowing orb represent, or was it just an artistic flourish of Lasseter's?
It was an artistic flourish, but it was supposed to be a light source. The whole thing when you're doing animations or even pictures is you always have a light source, and then how you distribute that light is important. So it was a sun or a moon or something, and the whole point is you see this shadow that's out behind him, and so the reason it was there was because he wanted a light source, an obvious light source that would allow him to draw the shadow. We later chose to, well, that's up there, so we'll put UNIX in it. That, of course, was highly contentious. AT&T had an absolute cow about that, and so you'll see later that it gets wiped out. And then FreeBSD didn't really fit in there because it was too long. So UNIX is nice and it fits in a round object, but so the glowing orb has just been a glowing orb. And then, of course, the sperm cell was just because he was chasing it. And of course, you have to have the streaming out behind, so how do you know it's moving if you don't see the stream coming out behind it?
So if I remember correctly, at some point, Wasabi Systems had some swag that involved a green version of the Beastie with like a Japanese headscarf or something like that. Did you ever get a copy or were aware of that?
I was definitely aware of it, and I almost certainly got some piece of that swag. Although when I was going through my T-shirts, I don't recall coming across it. But I had to put that whole talk together in about 3 days' time, and I had these 5 boxes of photos, and about maybe 40 large boxes of T-shirts to go through, and so a lot of it was like. And so I didn't really look at every single shirt. They're folded up, so you just see like a little piece of it, and it's like, no, no, no. Oh, that might be interesting. Throw it over here, etc. It was actually good because we live in a small house, and my T-shirt collection was beginning to encroach on living areas. And so part of it was that I packed the back of our Prius as full as I could with boxes of T-shirts, and I actually took them down to the Developers Summit. And so they were, all stretched out across the front. And I, picked up some examples. But at the end of it, I said, all these over here is just swag that I got. If you want it, it's yours. And these over here are the ones that I've previously sold, so that you had to pay for those. And when I basically said, and, you can, the whole room just descended on it. And it was like locusts. You could just sort of see the piles going down and down and down. So I would say I probably about 2/3 of the shirts, I brought maybe 200 shirts. And I went home with like a partially full box of, one set of shirts. So, and I also got $800 for selling shirts. So, it worked out.
I just had a quick comment. I used to work at Wasabi Systems, so if you want some of that swag, I can get it to you.
Huh.
Right. And your name is? Ian. His name is Ian.
You better be careful. If they're anything like what people that came to my talk, you're going to be swamped. Okay. Anything else? All right. Thank you for coming. Come down and see the puzzle.